What happens when a billionaire CEO steps into an elevator and comes out forever changed? They say he hadn't truly smiled since his wife passed away. 6 years of silence, of control, of building empires with a frozen heart. And yet, on one ordinary morning, inside one broken elevator, something shifted. She was just a secretary, Clara Whitmore. 36, practical, polite, invisible to most, but not to him. And certainly not after that moment. Why did she stay in a job meant to break people? What made her walk away then come back stronger than ever? And what exactly did he write in that letter he never sent? This isn't a love story filled with grand gestures. It's a quiet one, a real one, the kind that blooms in silence and survives between the 9th and 10th floors. If you believe in stories that heal, that whisper rather than shout, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. They said Graham Ashford hadn't truly smiled in 6 years, not since the funeral. Not since the casket was lowered into the frozen earth of a private cemetery just outside of Concord, New Hampshire. Not since he stood alone in the cold, one gloved hand clutching a single rose, the other holding the silence of everything he'd lost. But that morning, inside a softly lit elevator in Boston, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. Just a look, brief, flickering caught between brass walls and early morning shadows. And in that fleeting second, something in his eyes made Clara Whitmore forget how to breathe. The day had begun like any other. At 7:15 a.m., Clara stood in the break room, pouring dark roast into a ceramic mug the color of old parchment. No sugar, no cream, just the way he preferred it. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she placed the mug on the tray. Maybe it was the lack of sleep. Or maybe it was the way her heart had started to feel, too present lately, too loud in the quiet moments. The winter light poured into the office like milk through lace curtains, casting long, pale shadows over the herringbone floors. Ashford Capital wasn't like other firms. It didn't shimmer with glass walls and sleek design. It breathed with age-polished mahogany, oil paintings in gold frames, and the distant tick of grandfather clocks. Everything spoke of permanence, of legacy, of things not easily moved. Graham Ashford embodied that legacy. He was 44, tall, precise, the kind of man whose silence filled a room more than most people's voices ever could. People didn't just work for him. They adjusted themselves around him, like furniture moved slightly off-center to keep the room balanced. He wasn't unkind. He wasn't cruel. He was simply remote. And yet, Clara had stayed. For 5 years, she had handed him schedules, adjusted meeting rooms, ensured the right files were waiting at precisely the right moment. She learned not to speak when he furrowed his brow. She learned the difference between the silence that meant I'm thinking and the silence that meant not now. And over time, she saw the cracks, small ones, like the way he paused just for a second whenever someone mentioned children, or how his gaze would drift to the old photo on his desk when he thought no one noticed. A woman with auburn hair and kind eyes. His late wife, Emily? Clara never asked. It wasn't her place. But that morning, she noticed something else, something that unsettled her more than his usual detachment. When he walked past her desk, his tie wasn't straight, a millimeter off center. It might seem nothing to others, but for Graham, it was a breach of order. And in that moment, she knew something had changed. There was an email. She hadn't read it, of course. But she knew of its existence. An unsent draft, written late one night when the rest of the office was dark. He had typed it after she called in sick of fever that kept her in bed for 2 days. She'd returned to find him quieter than usual, which was saying something. That draft sat untouched in a folder labeled personal. He had reopened it the night before, added a single line, then closed it again. No one saw, but Clara sensed it. By 7:42 a.m., the elevator arrived on the ground floor as always. She waited just outside the doors, coffee balanced carefully, her coat still buttoned high to the neck. She could hear his footsteps long before she saw him measured, even echoing through the marble corridor. And then, there he was. Graham gave her a slight nod, eyes unreadable. She returned it, lips pressed together in the kind of smile you give when too many words are lodged behind your ribs. They stepped in together. The doors closed. Brass walls reflected their images faintly, almost ghost-like. The elevator began its ascent with a soft hum. Floor 2. Floor 3. Clara stood to his right, the coffee still warm between her palms. The scent of it filled the space, a bitter comfort, familiar and grounding. She glanced at him, just once. He was looking straight ahead, his posture perfect. But then, barely there, his right hand curled slightly. A twitch in the fingers, the kind that happens when someone's holding something in too tightly. Floor 6, floor 7. The silence felt heavier than usual, not tense, not cold, just full, like a room with too many unopened letters. Floor 8. Graham shifted, as if about to speak. Clara's heart climbed into her throat. But then, the elevator jolted. A loud clunk. Lights flickered. The floor beneath them shivered slightly. The hum stopped. So did everything else. The small screen above the door read 9. They were between floors, trapped in a steel box 10 stories above the city. Clara's breath caught, not in panic, but in awareness. This moment wasn't routine. She turned to him. He was still staring forward, but his shoulders had tensed, his jaw clenched. For the first time in years, he looked unsettled, human. No one said a word. No alarms. No voices over intercom. Just the quiet click of time folding in on itself. The elevator lights dimmed, casting their reflections in a soft golden haze. Clara realized she was still holding the coffee, still hadn't handed it to him. She should have spoken, asked if he was all right, reached for the emergency button. But instead, she watched him. And in that suspended breath of a moment, she saw at his eyes, not cold, not controlled, but tired, fractured, almost like he was searching for the right words in a language neither of them had spoken before. This wasn't just another Tuesday. This wasn't just another silence. Clara hadn't planned on staying more than 6 months. That was 5 years ago. She had arrived in Boston with one suitcase, a second-hand coat, and a heart still tender from too much loss too close together. Her mother had passed away suddenly the previous spring, an undetected heart condition, they said. Her father, already in the early stages of Alzheimer's, slipped further into confusion with each passing week, until he no longer recognized the face of the daughter who now cared for him. Teaching had once been Clara's anchor. In a small town in Maine, she had taught high school literature for nearly a decade. Salinger, Dickinson, Baldwin, all the voices that gave shape to silence. But after everything, the classroom walls felt hollow. Her voice, once sure and steady in front of teenagers who barely looked up from their phones, began to tremble. So, she left. Boston was never meant to be permanent. It was a pause, a place to earn just enough money to stabilize things back home, maybe help move her father into a better care facility. The job posting at Ashford Capital had seemed almost too good to be true. Executive secretary, high pay, prestigious firm. The only caveat was the reputation of the man she'd be working for, Graham Ashford. Clara had heard whispers even before her interview. He was brilliant, ruthless, emotionally unreachable, the kind of man who didn't just expect perfection, he inhaled it. No one lasted more than a month. Secretaries rotated in and out like seasons. But Clara was used to hard people. Grief had taught her how to listen without reacting, and maybe, in some quiet corner of her heart, she needed the distraction of someone more broken than she was. She wore her mother's watch to the interview. It was cracked at the edge, but still kept perfect time. Graham had looked at her only once, eyes scanning her resume with clinical precision. His voice was low, deliberate. He didn't ask about her personal life. He asked if she could keep up, if she could handle stress, if she understood the value of silence in an office where time equaled money. Clara had simply nodded. He hired her on the spot. The first 3 weeks were brutal. Long hours, unspoken expectations, a minefield of micro-decisions, how to word his emails, which clients required his attention, when to knock and when not to. He never praised, never smiled, but he didn't correct her, either, and somehow, that felt like trust. Clara observed him with the quiet precision of someone who'd learned to read between the lines. Graham never looked anyone directly in the eye. When he was overwhelmed, his gaze would drop, as if to retreat inward. He hated the sound of paper being torn. Once, she'd shredded a misprinted memo and noticed his jaw tighten. From then on, she always recycled instead. She never asked questions unless necessary, never lingered, and in return, he let her stay. By the end of the 3rd month, something had shifted. He no longer reviewed every document she handed him. He stopped double-checking the call logs. On Thursday mornings, he'd pause for a half-second by her desk, as if expecting something, though neither of them would say what. Still, Clara kept her distance. She wore the detachment like a uniform, just like her tailored blouses and quiet heels. She told herself this was just a job, a very good job, yes, but nothing more. She still planned to leave, someday, but she didn't. And neither did he ask her to. One late evening, while sorting supplies in the copy room, she accidentally placed a pen at the wrong angle in Graham's desk organizer. It was minor, insignificant, really. She didn't notice until the next morning, when she returned to his office with a printed schedule and saw it, the pen, corrected, aligned perfectly parallel to the edge of the tray. He hadn't said a word. She stared at it longer than she meant to, something fluttering beneath her ribs. It wasn't about the pen, it was about what it meant he had noticed. That was how they communicated, she realized, through the quiet, through what wasn't said, a kind of language made of details, rituals, glances, proximity, like how he always left the blinds slightly open when she was in the room, though he preferred working in dim light, or how she'd refill the water carafe before meetings without being asked, and he always drank without hesitation. One evening in early December, as snow dusted the tops of the city's stone buildings, Clara found herself alone in the office long after others had gone. She stood at the window of the executive floor, watching lights flicker in the apartments across the street, imagining the lives within dinners being cooked, children being tucked in, radios playing old Christmas songs. Behind her, she heard the faint click of a door closing. Footsteps. She didn't turn around. Graham stopped beside her, not too close, not too far. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city below glittered like a world neither of them belonged to. In that silence, Clara felt something settle in her, something she hadn't allowed herself to name. Connection, familiarity, something dangerously close to care. He said nothing, just stood there, his presence both grounding and impossible. Later that night, as she rode the elevator down alone, she touched the pen in her coat pocket, the same one she had placed and he had corrected. She smiled, but it was small, and only for herself. There's a folder named Personal in Graham's inbox. It's not visible on the main interface. He had tucked it beneath a cascade of client folders and legal briefs, hidden among tax documents and project archives from nearly a decade ago. But it was there. And inside that folder, only one email sat, unsent, untouched, unread by anyone but him. He had written it 4 months ago, on a Monday night. The office had been quieter than usual. Clara was home, out sick for the first time since she'd started working for him. Something about the air conditioner malfunctioning the previous Friday, she'd said with a tired voice over the phone. Fever, mild chills. She'd be back soon. The email began plainly. Clara, he had typed, fingers hovering over the keyboard longer than necessary. There's something I haven't said, and I fear I may never find the right time to. He had stared at that sentence for nearly 10 minutes. Then the words had started coming tentative, halting, like footsteps across fresh snow. He wrote about the days that felt less gray since she arrived, about the way her presence had begun to soften the edges of a life that had grown too quiet, too controlled. He admitted things he never had to anyone, not even to himself. "I didn't realize how numb I'd become until your laughter returned sound to the room," he wrote. It wasn't a confession of love, not directly. But it was personal, vulnerable, honest, and that terrified him. He saved the draft instead of sending it, told himself it was foolish, that she might misunderstand, that he'd be crossing a line neither of them could retreat from. Weeks passed, then months. The email stayed in that folder, a ghost of an emotion never spoken. But this morning was different. The snow had fallen overnight in a quiet hush, blanketing the streets in a soft white layer that seemed to slow the entire city. Graham arrived earlier than usual. His shoes left crisp impressions in the carpeted hallway, and the elevator ride up felt slower, heavier, as if the building itself had sensed his hesitation. He walked into his office and didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he sat at his desk, opened the folder labeled Personal, and reread the email, all 218 words of it. His hand hovered over the keyboard. He added a new line. "If I don't say this soon, I'll lose the only good thing left." He sat back, breathing quietly. The room was warm, but the skin on the back of his neck prickled. It wasn't that he believed she felt the same. He didn't allow himself that hope. But she mattered, more than the board meetings, more than the quarterly forecasts, more than the image he spent years constructing like armor. And he was tired of silence, tired of pretending, tired of fearing that one day she would simply disappear, and he would have said nothing. He looked at the clock, 9:16 a.m. The meeting at 10 would be brief. After that, he would send the message. He rehearsed the moment in his mind, the chime of the elevator, the soft click of her shoes on the hallway floor, the coffee in her hand. He would tell her he had sent her something. Nothing dramatic, just a note. She could read it when she had time, maybe after lunch, and then he would wait. At 9:28, the office door opened softly. "Clara." He didn't turn right away. He heard the sound of her coat brushing the edge of the doorframe, the quiet rustle of her placing something on the credenza, probably the coffee. Her rhythm was always gentle in the morning, never rushed. It calmed him. But today, her steps slowed. He could feel her gaze. He was still staring at the screen, at the word send. His hand rested lightly on the mouse, unmoving. Clara stood there a moment longer before speaking, but no words came. Anne Graham, sensing the fragile equilibrium, didn't look up, not yet. There was something sacred about that pause, like the breath held before a first note in a symphony, or the hush that falls over a congregation before the vows are spoken. And in that pause, both of them knew something was close to breaking open. Graham moved his finger, ever so slightly, over the trackpad. The cursor hovered. He didn't click, not yet. The lights flickered once. He glanced toward the window. Snow continued to fall, soft and relentless. Then, as Clara turned to leave the room quietly, respectfully, as always he opened his mouth to say something, but before the words could take shape, the power blinked again. A dim warning light came on overhead. They both looked up, and in that moment, everything they'd carefully not said seemed to press in from all sides. At 9:34 a.m., they stepped into the elevator together. Coffee, silence, two people standing inches apart, with a lifetime of words between them. The doors slid shut, and then, somewhere between the 9th and 10th floors, the elevator shuddered and stopped. The elevator stuttered to a stop between the 9th and 10th floors. A soft jolt, a flicker of lights. A brief silence that followed, not like a pause, but like something forgotten, remembering how to breathe. And for the first time in 5 years, Graham Ashford looked truly unguarded. He didn't speak, didn't frown. He simply stared ahead, his reflection dimmed in the brass paneling, eyes wide, not with fear exactly, but with the absence of control. Clara stood beside him, clutching the now lukewarm coffee cup with both hands. Her fingers pressed tightly against the paper sleeve. The elevator lights had shifted. What was once bright and sterile had become a muted amber glow, casting long shadows on the carpeted floor. It felt like time had folded in on itself. She looked over at him. His chest rose too quickly. Shallow breaths. Shoulders pulled taut beneath his gray wool coat. His jaw clenched and unclenched in tiny movements, like he was arguing with something inside his own mind. No signal on either phone, no announcement from the building, just the quiet hum of machinery that no longer worked. Clara took a small step sideways, not close enough to intrude, just enough to make room for comfort if he needed it. She could feel it radiating off him, panic, tightly caged and rising. Then she remembered a story he had once let slip accidentally during a board dinner. He had been trapped in a wooden crawl space as a child, playing hide and seek with cousins. The hatch had jammed, and he had been alone in the dark for nearly an hour. His uncle found him crying, fists bloody from pounding the door. He hated confined spaces, hated losing the illusion of choice. Graham shifted his weight slightly, his hands still at his sides, but trembling now almost imperceptibly. And still, he said nothing. Clara slowly lowered the coffee cup onto the elevator's side rail. Then, without fully thinking, she did something she had never done in all her time working for him. She reached for his hand. She didn't grab it, didn't hold it, just let her fingertips touch the back of his knuckles light as breath. Quiet as trust. His eyes closed, a sharp inhale. Then slowly, as if peeling away from something old and brittle, his hand turned over and found hers. Their fingers didn't interlace, but they stayed touching, and in that contact, small, simple something ancient inside him cracked open. When he spoke, his voice was not the commanding baritone of boardrooms and press conferences. It was smaller, raw, like a note played too softly but felt deep in the chest. "Why do you stay?" Clara. She blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. He looked at her now directly. No barrier, no shield, just Graham, not the CEO, not the man behind the empire, just a human being, asking a question too long buried. She didn't answer, because the truth was complicated, and he already knew it. He looked away again, staring at the glowing number 9 above the door, as if it held the answer to everything. And then he spoke again. But not like before, not as a man searching for control. He spoke like someone surrendering. "I've tried to keep it buried," he said slowly, his words more breath than sound. "Tried to hold the line, be professional, distant. You've made it so easy to care, Clara, and so impossible to stop." She felt her heart skip, her fingers flex slightly against his. "I told myself it was admiration, respect, trust, but it isn't just that anymore. And I think I knew that the day you got the flu and the office felt—" He paused, emptier than usual. Clara remained silent, her breath slow, her shoulders stiff, but her face soft. Graham lowered his gaze. "I was going to send it today. The email, the one I wrote 4 months ago and never had the courage to share." A pause. "I added one more line this morning. Said, if I don't say this soon, I'll lose the only good thing left." The elevator lights buzzed faintly above. He let go of her hand gently and stepped half a pace back. "I know this ruins everything," he said, his voice steadier now. "But I need you to know, before the door opens, before I pretend again." Then came the part he hadn't meant to say. Not out loud, not here. "I turned down the Vornell acquisition last month," he said quietly. "It was a $300 million deal. Would have tripled our global presence." Clara blinked, startled. She knew of the deal. Everyone did. They wanted to restructure, he continued, bring in their own leadership. That included replacing our team, including you. His eyes met hers. "I told them no." A beat. Clara's lips parted slightly, but no words came. The air felt thick, charged, fragile. He waited, for anger, for disappointment, for relief, for anything. But Clara just looked at him, and in her gaze was not judgment, Not rejection, but neither was it agreement or surrender. It was something else. Stillness. The kind that lives between fear and readiness, between past and future, between heartbeats. She wasn't ready, and he saw that. So, he gave her something rare silence, the kind that didn't push, the kind that honored where she was. The elevator didn't move, but something between them had. By the next morning, her desk was empty. No letter, no goodbye, just the absence that echoed louder than any words. The mug she always used, a pale green ceramic with a small chip near the base, was gone. So was the blanket she kept draped over the back of her chair for when the air conditioning ran too cold. The paper tray sat neatly stacked, untouched, no scattered notes, no scribbled reminders. Graham noticed it before anyone else. He paused at her workstation longer than he meant to, his eyes scanning the space as if trying to read between objects. Everything looked too still, too clean, like a photo of something no longer living. At 7:53 a.m., his inbox chimed, an email. Subject, leave of absence, request from Clara Whitmore. Send 7:49 a.m., dear Mr. Ashford, due to a personal emergency, I respectfully request 2 weeks of unpaid leave, effective immediately. Thank you for your understanding. Sincerely, Clara Whitmore. There were no other details. Graham stared at the message, reading it over and over, as if more meaning might emerge from the white space between sentences. She hadn't even signed it, Clara. Just Clara Whitmore. Professional, final. He didn't reply. Not immediately. Instead, he sat in the stillness of his office, the glow of the morning light washing over his desk like something trying to cleanse. But it didn't reach him. At 10:15 a.m., he walked into the boardroom and presented the quarterly report with the same calm, even tone he was known for. His tie was straight, his words precise, not one crack in the glass. Only Clara would have known the difference. Back in Vermont, the sky hung low and colorless. The snow had softened the roads into winding ribbons of white, and the trees stood bare against the wind. Clara arrived at the care facility just after lunch. Her father had been moved to a quieter wing, where the lights stayed dim and the music playing in the hallway was always something from decades ago. Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole. He didn't recognize her that day. He rarely did anymore. She sat beside him, humming softly as she fed him spoonfuls of chicken broth, wiping his chin gently between sips. Her hands moved with quiet rhythm, the way they used to when she read poetry aloud in class, letting each word land like a leaf in still water. She stayed with him for hours, not just to help, but to escape. The snow continued falling outside the wide window near his bed, and Clara watched it like someone waiting for an answer to appear between the flakes. The warmth of the room was deceptive. Inside her, something had gone cold. That night, back at her childhood home, a modest, white-paneled house with creaky floorboards and a chimney that never quite worked right. Clara made tea in the same chipped kettle her mother had used. The familiarity should have comforted her, but it didn't. She sat by the front window, legs tucked beneath an old quilt, her mug untouched. The phone didn't ring. She didn't expect it to, but still. She watched the silence like it was something alive. An old friend of the family, Mrs. Dalton, stopped by the next morning, a woman in her 70s, with a voice like cinnamon and a walk slowed by Winters. She brought over banana bread and the warmth of old eyes that had seen too much and still found ways to be kind. "You're quiet," she said gently, placing the bread on the kitchen table. Clara shrugged. "Just tired." "Mrs. Dalton looked at her, long and steady. "You know," she said, pulling out a chair with the care of someone who'd once known grace and movement, "when I was your age, I left a man I loved because I thought leaving was safer than asking if I was loved back." Clara said nothing. "Mrs. Dalton continued, voice softer now. "And do you know what stayed with me? Not the fear, not the silence. What stayed was the not knowing. Clara's throat tightened. "I see that look in your eyes," the woman said, rising slowly. "It's the look of someone who left something before they asked if it was worth staying for." That night, Clara lay in her old room, staring at the ceiling. Her hands rested flat against her stomach, the weight of 100 unsaid things pressing against her ribs. She thought of Graham's voice in the elevator, the way it trembled, the way he had looked at her not as a superior, not as a boss, but as a man asking her to see him. And she had said nothing, not out of cruelty, not even fear, but out of the old instinct to run before being asked to choose. What she didn't know, what she would not know for several more days, was that Graham had written her a letter, a real one, not an email, not a text, but ink on paper, folded carefully and handed to the receptionist with simple instructions. "Please make sure Clara gets this." It never reached her, filed in the wrong place, buried beneath a stack of envelopes that had nothing to do with hearts or choices, forgotten. And so, while she sat by the window each morning, watching the snow fall like pages unwritten, she believed he had said all he wanted to say, but something in her refused to settle. A thread of tension remained, knotted deep in her chest. It wasn't grief, it wasn't guilt, it was the quiet ache of possibility, of something unfinished. She found it by accident, tucked beneath the corner of an old annual report, one of those thick, glossy ones with pie charts and polished language no one ever really reads. Clara had reached into the bottom drawer of her old filing cabinet to retrieve a box of stationery she'd left behind, intending to take it home as she packed the last of her things. Her fingertips brushed something firmer than paper. A corner bent upward. She pulled it out. A cream-colored envelope, no logo, no printed header, just her name, handwritten in dark blue ink. Clara. Her breath hitched, the edges of the room suddenly sharpening around her. For a long moment, she didn't move. The office was empty. Saturday morning, just her and the quiet hum of heating vents. Outside the windows, the Boston skyline stood hushed under winter's gray light. But inside, time had stopped. She broke the seal slowly, her fingers trembling just enough to blur the letters as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Elegant. Controlled. A little too careful. "Clara, I know I've already said too much, but there are things I cannot leave unsaid. Not anymore. If you're reading this, it means I found the courage too late, and perhaps you've already moved on. But just in case you haven't, just in case there's still a window, however small, know this. Every version of silence between us was louder than the words I wanted to say. You made the days less gray, the air lighter. You gave back meaning to routines I'd buried in structure. If you're still willing, meet me this Saturday, 3 p.m., rooftop garden, no expectations, no pressure, just a chance. Graham." She read it once, then again, then a third time. By the fourth, her hands were no longer steady. Tears began to slip silently down her cheeks, not loud, not gasping, just the quiet kind that come when the heart recognizes something it never thought it would see. A truth, written plainly, not perfect, but real. Clara sat back on the edge of the filing cabinet, the letter resting in her lap like something sacred. Her mind flooded with the hours they had shared, years of measured glances, gestures understood but never named. How many mornings had she passed him coffee, willing herself not to look too long at the man behind the nameplate? How many times had she almost said something, almost asked? And now, here it was. The question made visible. If you're still willing? She looked around the room, the faint indent her chair had left in the carpet. The pen holder still tilted at the precise angle he preferred. The tiny crack in the corner of the window she used to glance through while waiting for his meetings to end. It wasn't just a job, had never been. The decision to leave had felt rational, practical, but now that practicality curled at the edges. Because now, she knew, he hadn't been silent out of indifference. He had been holding something, waiting for her to open the door. And she had almost missed it. She stood, walked to the bathroom at the end of the hall, and looked at herself in the mirror. The same mirror she'd glanced into every morning at 7:57 a.m. before heading to his office. Today, her reflection looked older, somehow tired, but honest. She whispered the question into the silence. Do I have the courage to go? It wasn't about Graham alone. It was about her, about whether she could stand in front of something fragile and real, knowing it might not lead where she hoped, but that it was worth showing up for anyway. She pressed a tissue to her cheeks, straightened the collar of her coat, and folded the letter back into its envelope. By 2:17 p.m., she was walking toward the building. Snow was falling again, just lightly, more of a hush than a storm. She passed the cafe where she used to pick up his breakfast when meetings ran long. The florist who once delivered white tulips to his office every February, no note, just flowers he never explained. The city hadn't changed, but she had. She reached the front lobby by 2:39, nodded politely to the weekend receptionist, stepped into the elevator at 2:45. As the doors closed around her, the space felt smaller than she remembered, but not in a suffocating way. More like a capsule, a place between endings and beginnings. She glanced up at the numbers lighting above the door. Her heart beat faster with each floor, not with fear, but with choice. This wasn't the same elevator that had once trapped them. Not really. This one was moving, and so was she. She arrived 10 minutes early, because when a man like Graham Ashford asks you to meet him with an open heart, you don't risk being late. The rooftop garden wasn't grand. It wasn't the kind featured in magazines or real estate listings. It was quiet, simple rows of evergreen shrubs lining the perimeter, a small wooden bench near the east wall, a scattering of iron chairs with their paint slightly faded by sun and rain. In the center stood a single lamppost, its bulb faintly glowing in the graying afternoon light. Winter had softened the garden, dusting the stone paths with snow and brushing frost onto the leaves that refused to fall. Clara stepped through the rooftop door, closing it gently behind her. The wind met her first, curling around her coat sleeves and lifting the ends of her hair. She pulled her navy wool coat closer to her body, the same one she wore when she moved to Boston. Its seams were slightly frayed now, but it still held its shape. Her gloves were brown leather, worn but soft. Her boots made a quiet rhythm on the stone as she walked, and her eyes slightly red from the wind. Or perhaps something deeper remained steady. She was ready, not certain, not fearless, but ready. At first, she didn't see him. The garden was still, the city behind it humming like a distant thought. Then there he was, standing near the edge, facing the skyline, hands in his pockets, shoulders drawn up slightly, like someone bracing against cold or memory. He wore a charcoal gray coat, tailored, formal, but there was something unguarded in the way he stood, like he hadn't moved in a while. Clara stopped walking. For a moment, she just looked at him. It had been only 2 weeks since the elevator, only 2 weeks since she'd left without saying goodbye. But in that short span of silence, something had shifted between them, not broken, but revealed. The kind of change that didn't need words to be understood. She took another step forward, then another. Her footsteps crunched lightly over the frost, and that was when he turned. Graham Ashford turned to face her. Their eyes met across the distance, and just like that, everything stilled. No one else was there. No clock ticking, no boardroom agendas, no performance, just two people, two souls standing in the truth of what had been unsaid for far too long. He didn't smile at first. His face held something quieter, relief, laced with disbelief, as if part of him hadn't fully allowed the hope that she would come, that she would read the letter, that she would still want to know. But she had. She did. And she had come early. Clara took the final steps until they stood only a few feet apart. No one spoke, not at first. He looked at her gloves, then her eyes, then back again. She looked at the faint line above his brow, the one that deepened when he read contracts too closely. It was there now, but softer, finally. He broke the silence not with poetry, not with declarations, just 3 words. You came. Clara exhaled steady and clear. Then she answered, her voice low and sure. I was early. That was all. But it was enough. For Graham, those 3 words opened something. A door, a window, a life that had been waiting at the edge of hesitation. And in that space, something shifted. Not in grand gestures, not in a sudden embrace, but in the way his shoulders relaxed, just slightly, in the way his lips parted not to speak, but to breathe, and in the way his eyes softened, meeting hers without fear. Then a smile, small, tentative, but real. Not the polite curve he used in press releases or the business charm required for diplomacy, but something deeper, something that had been buried, something that belonged only to her. His first real smile in years. Clara saw it and answered with one of her own, gentle, full of history, of longing, of everything they had walked through to reach this moment. The snow continued to fall in fine flakes, landing lightly on their shoulders, melting before they could stay. But neither moved, neither spoke again. Not yet. Because when the heart has waited that long, the first words aren't always spoken out loud. Sometimes they're found in the stillness, in the standing, in the silence shared under a winter sky that had stopped trying to hide them. For 5 years, every word between them had passed through the filter of professionalism, schedules, deliverables, calendar invites, and follow-up notes. Even when their eyes said more, their mouths obeyed the rules. But here above the noise of the city, where deadlines couldn't find them, it was just them. Clara and Graham sat side by side on a wrought iron bench beneath an old trellis, bare now in winter, but beautiful in its honest bareness. The vines had curled into themselves, their dried branches forming a fragile canopy overhead. A few leaves clung stubbornly to life, rustling softly in the wind like whispered confessions. The rooftop garden had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Few employees used it. It wasn't glamorous. But Graham had visited often in the early years, before the silence took root. Now, it felt like neutral ground, like truth's waiting room. They sat with a gentle space between them, not distance, just room. Room to breathe, to think, to say what had never been said. Clara adjusted her glove. Graham rested his hands on his knees, fingers folded neatly. The air smelled faintly of pine and cold stone. He spoke first. The first time I noticed you, he said, eyes forward, voice quiet, wasn't your first day. Clara looked at him, curiosity warming her features. It was week 3. You were walking a nervous intern through his first meeting. His collar was turned inside out. A small smile flickered at the edge of Graham's mouth. You didn't say a word, you just reached over and fixed it. No embarrassment, no fuss, just kindness. Clara smiled, soft and steady. Liam? He used to eat lunch in the stairwell because he thought the kitchen was too corporate. Graham chuckled. The sound startled them both, a sound not of formality, but of release. Then it was her turn. The only time I saw you laugh before the elevator, Clara said gently, was about a year ago. You opened an email from your niece. Graham raised an eyebrow. The golden retriever, she nodded, wearing sunglasses and a party hat. You thought no one saw you. I was sure no one did. Well, Clara said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. You smiled like it hurt a little. There was no bitterness in her voice, just observation, and maybe a trace of tenderness. They both laughed now, nothing loud or performative. Just the kind of shared laugh that doesn't need an explanation. It wasn't about the dog or the intern. It was about being allowed to laugh, together, without roles or ranks standing in the way. A breeze swept through, lifting Graham's coat lapels. He shifted slightly, angling toward her. Then, carefully measuring his own voice, he said, I spoke with the board. Clara turned to him, brows raised slightly. Last week, he continued. Before I wrote the letter, I told them I was considering stepping down. Silence stretched between them, not awkward but deliberate. It's not about the scandal, he added quickly. There is none. No rumors, nothing leaked. But I knew, if this, he glanced briefly between them, has any hope, It deserves the dignity of not being hidden. Clara's eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. But her breath did pause for a second, a small intake, the kind you feel more than hear. She looked at him not as an executive, not as the man who once lived behind glass walls, but as someone who was offering her his reality, not just his affection. "And you're willing to give that up?" she asked, voice quieter now, not questioning his sincerity, just trying to understand the depth of it. Graham nodded once. The title, the company, the pressure. I built those things after I lost what mattered most. And I've clung to them like they were enough. He turned to her fully now. But they're not. A bird landed briefly on the edge of the rooftop railing, ruffled its feathers, then flew off into the wind. The moment held, undisturbed. Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the silence settle like snow, soft, steady, necessary. She folded and unfolded her gloves in her lap. She looked down at the stone under her feet, then up at the gray, expansive sky. Then finally her gaze returned to his. And though she didn't say yes, something in her expression shifted. It wasn't just appreciation. It wasn't even relief. It was consideration, serious, weighted, real, like someone tracing the shape of something precious before deciding whether to hold it with both hands. Graham saw it. He didn't push, didn't ask for more than what she could give in that moment. Because sometimes, the most honest thing a person can offer is time to think. The next morning, he made the coffee. It was slightly too strong, the kind that lingered on the tongue a little longer than expected. But she drank every sip with a smile, because it wasn't about the coffee. It was about the gesture, the quiet offering of something unfamiliar, domestic, unpolished, real. Graham's penthouse was not what Clara imagined. It wasn't glass and chrome and the cold elegance of wealth. It was warm, but frozen in time, like a place paused mid-thought. The walls were painted soft gray, but behind the couches and shelves, subtle indentations marked where old picture frames had once hung. In the corner, near the fireplace, sat a leather armchair, creased, lived in. The kind someone used to sit in every evening, maybe with a book, maybe with silence. Clara's eyes wandered not with judgment, but with gentle curiosity. Bookshelves lined the east wall, filled to the edge but clearly untouched. A thin layer of dust clung to the top row. Several titles were turned backward, spines facing in, as if someone had decided not to be reminded. Above the mantel was a landscape painting soft hills in a fall, golden trees bending toward a quiet lake. The signature in the bottom corner was faint, but she recognized it. His late wife had painted it. She didn't ask, and he didn't offer the story. But when he caught her looking, he simply nodded once, as if to say, yes, she was here, she mattered. But this is not about going back. They sat at the small breakfast table near the window, overlooking the river. The sky was just beginning to brighten, the city below slow to stir. Graham wore a navy sweater, sleeves pushed to the elbows, his hands wrapped around his mug, knuckles pale. There was a quietness about him, but not the kind that shut people out. This one invited her in. Clara, still in her wool coat, had taken off her gloves but left her scarf loosely wrapped. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, whether from the cold or something else. Neither of them said. They spoke, not about decisions, not about titles or roles or how the next week would unfold. They talked about books. She loved Steinbeck. He leaned toward Salinger, though he admitted he hadn't read fiction in years. They talked about her mother, how she used to hum Patsy Cline while cooking, how grief arrived in quiet waves, even years later. They talked about the company, the parts Graham loved, the parts that cost him more than he'd ever admit out loud. And slowly between stories, between long pauses filled with nothing but trust, something softened. When Clara reached for a napkin, her eyes briefly landed on a small wooden box near the bookshelf, old, with brass hinges, the kind people used to store cufflinks or watches. Except this one had once held wedding rings. It sat slightly askew on the shelf, not hidden, but not displayed. Graham noticed her glance. He didn't move. He didn't explain. But Clara saw something important. It was closed, not displayed in longing, not left open in denial, closed, deliberately. She looked back at him, and in her gaze was no jealousy, no discomfort, just the quiet respect for a man who had once loved deeply, and was learning to love again not by erasing the past, but by making space for the future. They talked through breakfast, then through the hour after, and then into the soft hush of mid-morning, when the world outside had begun to buzz again. But inside, they remained untouched by urgency. There was no rush in this kind of conversation, no script. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something older, tenderness wrapped in truth. At one point, Graham leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his expression more open than she'd ever seen. "I'm scared too. Clara," he said. His voice didn't shake, but it lowered like it needed to be felt more than heard. "But I'm more scared of losing you." He didn't elaborate, didn't dramatize it, but the weight of that sentence filled the room. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked down into her mug, nearly empty now, coffee gone cold, but still held in her hands. She took a breath. Not the kind you take before retreating, but the kind you take before saying something you believe. "Let's not plan everything yet," she said quietly. "Let's just not pretend anymore." And that was it. No promises, no declarations, no guarantees of how or when or even if. Just a small agreement between two people who had run out of ways to hide. 6 months later, Clara Whitmore stood behind the podium, not as a secretary, but as the new director of people and culture at the Ashford Foundation. The ballroom was filled with quiet anticipation. Rows of white chairs faced a stage trimmed with soft lighting and tall vases of seasonal branches bare, elegant and honest. There were no towering floral displays, no dazzling visuals, just intention. The Foundation's first public event had drawn a mix of corporate partners, community leaders, and former colleagues from Ashford Capital, some curious, some skeptical, some simply intrigued by this new chapter in the company's story. Clara adjusted the microphone slightly. The room quieted. A moment of stillness stretched before her. She wore a slate-gray dress that moved softly when she breathed. Her hair was pinned back in a modest twist, a small silver pin resting above her left ear, one her mother used to wear to church on Sundays. Her shoes were practical, not flashy. She had never liked attention, but tonight, she didn't avoid it. She stood in it, fully. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the podium, and when she spoke, her voice was clear, not rehearsed, not overly polished, just steady, warm. 6 years ago, she began. "I was a literature teacher in Maine, telling students that words could change the world. I believed that deeply, but when life shifted beneath my feet, when grief arrived quietly and without permission, I stopped teaching." A pause, gentle, real. "I took a job in Boston, a job that, on paper, was temporary, practical, sensible. I told myself it was a pause, not a life, but pauses can last longer than we expect." Somewhere in the third row, a woman nodded slowly, her expression one of recognition. "Not pity. For 5 years. I worked behind someone else's schedule. I ordered lunch, booked flights, printed presentations. I watched an office full of brilliant people measure their worth by their output, by how little emotion they showed, and I followed along, until I couldn't anymore." Her eyes didn't waver. She didn't need to read from the paper in front of her. She wasn't making a speech. She was telling a truth. Because something small began to grow in that silence. A question. She let the pause settle, a moment of deliberate quiet, the kind that makes people lean forward. What if the most important thing I could do in this world wasn't hiding what I felt, but honoring it? There it was, the turning point. She glanced briefly to the right side of the ballroom. Graham was there, not at the front, not center stage, just beside a pillar. His posture relaxed, his hands loosely clasped. He wasn't watching her with ownership or pride. He was simply present. Clara returned her gaze to the audience. When the Ashford Foundation was born, she continued, it wasn't out of strategy, it was out of necessity. We had built a company that knew how to grow wealth. Now, it was time to grow people. She smiled genuine, soft, a smile that reached her eyes. And when they asked me to step into this new role, I didn't say yes right away. Not because I doubted the mission, but because I needed to ask myself if I could show up as someone whole. The room was completely silent. Even the clinking glasses had stopped. Then she leaned slightly closer to the microphone, as if confiding something just between her and whoever needed to hear it. Sometimes, the most important promotion you get in life is the permission to be fully human. A murmur moved through the room. Not applause, not yet, just a collective breath, a release, a knowing. Somewhere near the back, a man in a tailored suit rubbed his eyes discreetly. A younger woman clutched her notepad tighter, holding her breath. Clara let that moment live. Then she wrapped it gently. Tonight, we're not just launching a foundation. We're naming something many of us have forgotten, that kindness belongs in boardrooms, that grief deserves space, that people are not tasks to manage, but stories to listen to. She stepped back from the microphone. A single nod. No bow, no dramatics. And then applause. Not the kind that erupted, the kind that built slowly, honestly, from the chest, not just the hands. Graham didn't clap first. He waited, watching her as if seeing something unfold that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with her. Clara stepped down from the stage and returned to her table. As she sat, a soft warmth rose in her chest. Not triumph, not ego, just clarity. A quiet voice inside her saying, I didn't pretend. She reached for her water, her hand steady. The napkin at her place setting had a slight wrinkle in the fold. She smoothed it instinctively. Across the room, Graham caught her eye. She smiled, not for him, not because of him, but because she had become someone who could finally look at herself and say, I didn't disappear in the process. She showed up, fully, honestly, unapologetically. When Boston sleeps and the lights dim, that's when their love feels most real. Not in boardrooms, not at benefits or in speeches, but here in the soft hush of an ordinary Friday night, where the world asks nothing of them but to simply be. The apartment glowed with a warm amber hue. The kitchen clock ticked gently, blending into the faint hum of the city far below. Graham's sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. Flour dusted across the dark navy of his shirt like snow on midnight. Clara was barefoot, her hair pulled into a loose bun. A smudge of cinnamon on her cheek she hadn't noticed. They were making pie, or, rather, arguing about it. You're using too much nutmeg again, she said, not looking up from the mixing bowl. You say that every time, because you do it every time. Graham grinned, holding up the spice jar like a defense attorney presenting Exhibit A. Nutmeg is underrated. Clara reached over, plucked the jar from his hand, and set it far on the counter. So is subtlety. He laughed. A real, open laugh, the kind that reached his shoulders, that shook the edges of the room like wind through autumn leaves. She joined him, not because it was funny, but because it felt good to laugh like that with someone who had learned your silences first. They moved easily around each other now. No more hesitation at the edge of shared space. No more careful choreography to avoid brushing arms or overlapping footsteps. They had learned each other's rhythms like two dancers who once feared the music but now moved by instinct. The pie went into the oven with a satisfying thump. Graham set the timer, wiped his hands on a dish towel, and leaned against the counter. You ever think of leaving again? He asked, not with fear, just curiosity, the kind that comes from a quiet, shared life where even the smallest questions matter. Clara rinsed a spoon, turned off the tap, and looked over her shoulder. No, she said, not unless you keep overdoing the nutmeg. He smiled at that, not for the joke, but for the answer behind it. She crossed the room and stood beside him, their shoulders brushing gently. They didn't speak for a while. The kitchen had its own sounds, the ticking clock, the oven hum, the creak of old floorboards beneath soft footsteps. Then she said, softly, "Tell me about her." Graham didn't ask who. He knew, and he didn't flinch. He walked to the small wooden stool by the window and sat down. Clara joined him, folding her legs beneath her on the floor, resting her arms on his knee like someone unafraid of the past. She was bright, he said, and loud when she wanted to be. She made decisions quickly. She hated jazz, loved thunderstorms, painted without ever keeping what she made. Clara listened, not to compare, not to weigh herself against a memory, but to understand the parts of Graham shaped by love before her. She died angry, he added, at the world, at the diagnosis, at me, and for a long time, I couldn't forgive myself for that. Clara reached up, resting her hand over his. "You don't have to erase her to love me," she said quietly. His throat tightened, not from sadness, but from relief, from the grace of being seen without being asked to hide. The timer dinged. He helped her to her feet, and together they pulled the pie from the oven. It was lopsided, a little too brown on one side, but the smell was heavenly warm cinnamon and butter and nutmeg, even if slightly too much. They didn't wait for it to cool. Each took a fork and ate straight from the dish, leaning against the counter like teenagers who didn't yet know how to take life too seriously. The crust crumbled beautifully. Clara didn't mention the nutmeg again. At 10 o'clock, the old grandfather clock in the corner rang its deep, melodic chime. They didn't move. Clara leaned her head on Graham's shoulder. His hand found hers, fingers lacing easily together. No performance, no declarations, just presence. The kind that settles in slowly and stays. They didn't speak for a long while. They didn't need to, because this quiet, this warmth, this shared stillness was the answer to a question neither of them needed to ask anymore. They stepped into the elevator, floor 1 to 10, just like 5 years ago. But this time, nothing was unsaid. There was no awkward shuffle of feet, no stolen glances or tension in the air, thick enough to silence breath. Just the familiar chime of the elevator doors closing, the faint hum of machinery, and the warm quiet between two people who had already chosen one another again and again in small, unremarkable moments that had built something unshakable. It was the morning after the Foundation's benefit event. Clara had a meeting on the 10th floor. Graham had arrived early for a quiet breakfast with one of the board members. They hadn't planned to run into each other, but some things, it seemed, circled back with a gentler rhythm than chance. As the doors slid closed, Clara chuckled softly. "Well," she said, glancing up at the light flickering briefly above them. "Would you look at that?" The elevator stuttered for the briefest second, a hiccup. Not a failure. The kind of flicker most people wouldn't notice. But they did. Graham smiled. Déjà vu. Clara leaned her shoulder lightly against the back wall. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her, fingers resting on the soft fabric of her blazer. "You remember what you said here?" He didn't hesitate. His voice was soft, but firm. "I said I was terrified." She turned to face him fully now. Her eyes held the quiet strength of someone who had walked through fire and come out tender. Not hard. Me too. The elevator continued to rise, smooth now. The numbers glowed overhead. 3, 4, 5. No one else was on board. No interruptions. Just the two of them. Again, like the first time. But everything was different, because this time, they were not hiding from themselves. They stood there for a while, the silence not heavy, but whole. And then somewhere between floor 6 and 7, Clara stepped closer. Just half a step, enough for her coat to brush against his. Her hand found his, unhurried, familiar. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. At floor 8, Graham exhaled softly, then turned to her. His free hand cupped the side of her face, fingers grazing the line of her cheekbone with reverence, not urgency. They kissed, not the kind born of desperation or longing, but the kind that says, "I know you. I've waited with you. I'm here." It was light, gentle, real. The elevator hummed on. This was the same space that had once felt suffocating, the same space where truths had been too big to speak out loud. Now, it held nothing but peace. Clara pulled back slightly, resting her forehead against his. She smiled, not because the moment was perfect, but because it was true. And then floor 9, and slowly, floor 10. The elevator gave its familiar ding. They didn't rush to step out. They stood in that lingering pause, the breath between arrival and continuation. Graham spoke first, his voice lower than usual, almost like a thought spoken aloud. What the billionaire CEO did in that elevator. A pause. A smile curled at the corner of his lips. Changed his life forever. Clara let out a small laugh, the kind that carried old memories and new beginnings all at once. Well, technically, she teased, it took 2 elevators and a lot of missed chances. He nodded, eyes soft, and one very patient woman. She stepped out first. The hallway was quiet. Morning light spilled through the windows, golden and kind, the kind of light that doesn't ask for attention but offers it freely to everything it touches. Graham followed a few steps behind, pausing at the threshold. Clara turned, walking backward just for a moment, her steps light. "You coming?" He nodded once. "Always." And with that, the doors closed behind them quietly, without drama, without pause, but not without meaning. In a world that often measured success by acquisitions and numbers and polished presentations, they had found something deeper. Love that whispered, not shouted, presence that didn't need performance, a connection not born in grand declarations, but in eye contact held just a little too long, in coffee brewed a little too strong, in questions answered long after they were asked. They never had a wedding announcement in the paper, never posted photos or penned speeches about their journey, but they built a life, together, one evening at a time, one truth at a time. And sometimes, when the city got loud again, when emails piled up and meetings ran late, they would take the long way home, past the places that reminded them of beginnings. And when they reached their building, they always took the elevator. They never talked about it much. But every once in a while, as they passed floor 9 and moved toward 10, Clara would squeeze Graham's hand, and he would smile, because love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it slips between silence and eye contact. Sometimes, it waits, between the 9th and 10th floor, and when it finally arrives, not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty, it changes everything. Sometimes, the most profound changes in our lives don't begin with fireworks or grand gestures. They begin in quiet moments. A glance, a pause, a question we've been too afraid to ask. This story reminds us that love, real love, isn't always loud. It doesn't need an audience. It grows slowly, between unspoken understanding and patient presence. It waits, often, for us to find the courage to stop running from grief, from connection, from ourselves. Graham and Clara didn't find each other in their prime. They found each other in their healing, and that's what makes it beautiful. Because healing takes time, trust takes time, but when we allow ourselves to be seen, truly seen, without trying to impress or protect, that's when something real begins. So, wherever you are in your life, starting over, learning to feel again, or simply looking for peace, remember, it's never too late. You are not too far gone. And the elevator, whatever that may be for you, may still be waiting. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment of honesty to open a door you thought had long been closed. Thank you for spending your time with us, and for opening your heart to this story. If it touched you, even in a small way, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to tell stories that heal, connect, and inspire. Until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, some of the most beautiful things begin in silence.